So, if I can just go back to the start quickly. If I look at the housing and urban development questions, if I try and sort of tease them out and boil them down to something that's clear, it takes me back to when I did my MA thesis back in, I think I submitted it in 86, and then I did a PhD that I submitted in 93. And when I think back on these questions, they're still here. It's a long time for these questions still to be here, to be unresolved, And what are these questions? They are, and I'm going to just read this to you because it's probably going to be easier to just to sum this up. The first is, who will pay for housing and development? Who will pay? There's a cost to it. And this was very strongly on the agenda in the mid-80s already, when the rent boycotts first started happening, and they later became bond boycotts. And all about a mass of people who were excluded, saying they're not prepared to pay for this. You've got to pay for it. You, the elites, have got to pay for it. So who will pay for it? That question is still there. The second question is, how can the housing shortage be eliminated in the shortest possible time? Okay, you don't want to wait. I think you've mentioned some of the people in the informal settlements movement who said they don't want to actually have their children living in informal structures, okay? It's got to be done now. Got to have our freedom now. Reminds you of Husak, yeah? All here and now. So that I think is the second question. How can you resolve this in the shortest possible time? And the third question, which I think we all know is so crucial, and it was crucial then also, is where will this housing and development be delivered? In those days it was delivered on the urban periphery across the border of homeland sometimes. These days it's not delivered in areas where people are close to amenities or close to work, or nothing is being done in those areas to bring productive investment in there. So where is it going to happen? And then there's a fourth question also, and that question is about how all these things are going to happen. So we have a housing and development delivery system. It's a system that puts together financiers and contractors and policymakers, government, and people who facilitate the communities, to bring them in, and it's largely driven around profit. So can we go on with this delivery system that we have at the moment in order to meet the other three goals, or do we need to modify it? I say we clearly do need to modify it, but how do we need to modify it? Let's get more specific, and I'd like to just end off on three strategic points that I think are worthy of throwing out as a serious debate about how we could start modifying this system of ours. So although the focus is very theoretical, the answers are not what I call the Irving Jim answers. This is not we're a red organization and the revolution will sort it all out, okay? That was actually the answer that we were told of pre-94. Don't worry about class questions and all of that. Implement the Freedom Charter the day after liberation, and all the rest will follow. So we're not going there, okay, tonight. Well, I'm not going there tonight. Okay, so let's just go to the definition of neoliberalism. Just as an introduction to that, I think to start off, I see neoliberalism as both an ideology, so it's a logical system of ideas, and also as a practice. And these ideas are actually quite dogmatic. They see society in what I would call ontological terms. It's sort of a naturally given social formation. And as far as the practices are concerned, People who believe in sort of ideas of being economically efficient, competitive, etc., they also are practicing in various fields. They may be in business, they may be in government, and they are using their practices in their minds and in many of our minds as proof of the sort of correctness of the ideology. Often you'll see that there are contradictions that come up, and I'll just mention a few ways that these contradictions get papered over by people who might say, neoliberalism is cool. What's the problem? Get a life or whatever. Okay, so having said that, under the ideology of neoliberalism, I want to just look at it as a very basic thought pattern, as a form of empiricism. And then I want to cover, I think, 6 or 7 points, which are, there is no such thing as society, they're just individuals. Maggie Thatcher. The economy is a self-regulating mechanism. There's no difference between, there's no such thing as speculative or unearned income. All income is productive income. Banks are financial intermediaries, they recycle money from savers to borrowers. There's no limits to exponential economic growth. And the state and the economy are disconnected. So the state should keep itself disconnected also for our good. And there are in fact 2 states. There's an ideal state and an actual state. And unfortunately, those neoliberals in South Africa would say the corrupt actual state of South Africa has now captured the ideal state. And then there should ideally be no state, but that would make them anarchists. They can't say, so they rather would emphasize a small state. And then finally, they have an area called good governance, okay, which I think we should also talk about, as in the Good Governance Learning Network. So just to quickly go over those points again, I mentioned in the beginning that I'm a theoretician. I'm not an empiricist, and that empiricism says that there is no need for a theory to pull things together. It's actually, theorizing is seen by empiricists as abstract philosophizing by intellectuals, who generally are useless people. Sartre, in his Plea for Intellectuals, actually has an amazing exposition of this, that they interfere in things they don't know about, they're impractical, and later on, of course, they can become dangerous. I think they generally are seen as wasting time. So that's, in a nutshell, a very quick summary of empiricism. It's an entire study on its own, but I just wanted to mention that. So that's the type of ideology that neoliberalism is. It doesn't have to explain itself, You either get it or you don't, and if you don't, you're stupid. No society, just individuals. It's as if you're born fairly in a bubble, and you're fairly insulated from social influences around you, and you're not really constituted by society. You are constituted by yourself, by your own efforts, and if you don't make it, it's your fault. And if there are a whole group of poor people who don't make it, well, we can actually blame them, because they haven't got their shit together, and there's a problem with that. And why should we actually be politically correct and making excuses for them? So that's that point. The economy is a self-regulating mechanism. Here there's an assumption that the economy is prices in the economy. They deviate very seldom from a generally stable equilibrium price. They take what neoclassical economists call a random walk now and then, but generally the economy is in equilibrium, and it's a self-regulating mechanism, and the greatest degree of competition helps that self-regulation. And as far and they do not see rents and interest as under-earned income. They see rents and interest as being part of the factors of production and adding to gross domestic product. That's an important point that we'll come back to when we critique all this stuff. Banks as financial intermediaries, they don't create money. They simply recycle money. And I think that's a very important point when we look at the criticism as to why that's quite a central feature of this ideology. No limits to exponential growth. From a neoclassical perspective, it's as if there's no contradiction between the limited resources of the planet and exponential economic growth. And it's a mantra for economists and for government leaders. And if you question this, you open yourself to ridicule. Right at the beginning of this paper, I referred to, I think it was Schopenhauer's 3 stages of truth. The first stage is where it's ridiculed. So this is the first stage of that truth. That if you say there is a contradiction. And the second stage is when it's viciously attacked, and the third stage is when it's accepted as self-evident. The disconnect between the state and the economy. The state and the economy are seen as completely disconnected. And as I mentioned earlier, there are 2 states over here. There's this ideal state, which is it's very much in the line of the German philosopher Hegel's thinking, that reason appears finally on earth in the form of the capitalist state. It's the highest form of political reason. And this is the one pure state. But there can be corrupt states, which is the second actual state. So you won't necessarily open up the business newspaper or read people who support neoliberalism saying this. I'm drawing out implications. It's part of maybe a theoretical analysis that there are implications which people may say, I never said that, but the implication is that there are these 2 states and that the actual state can corrupt the ideal state. The no state, small state, I've dealt with that. The good governance stuff is about transparency, it's about proper accounting for how you spend money, it's about being responsive, it's about being inclusive, it's about being effective and efficient. All things that are very, very abstract in themselves, and you can't question any one of those principles of good governance. But where it becomes really interesting is that it's focused usually on achieving the neoclassical economic goals of GDP growth and export orientation, maximizing profitability, minimizing human resource costs, outsourcing, privatizing state functions. So you've got to understand that if it happens in that context, if you're working in a context where that's happening, I think of the Open Society funded NGOs that, from my reading of Mr. Soros and his philosophies based on Karl Popper, who was a hero of his, that's how he understands these values, which in a different context, in an organization, you could actually embrace. Just moving on quite quickly, because I'm not going to finish on time. The practical the practices are really about privatization and deregulation. I'm not going to go into all the examples because I think you're fairly familiar with them. There's also a practice called asset stripping. So companies are seen as being, it's important for companies to provide shareholder value rather than to invest in long-term sustainability of the company as a whole. It's long-term productive profitability and ultimately to look after its employees who are producing that. And so you have very short-term approaches. You have focusing just on your core work. outsourcing all your other parts of your company, and ideally, from that point of view, outsourcing your labor force to labor brokers. So that's what the asset stripping is about. And then finally, financialization, where money is invested to make more money. It's not productive investment. And financialization is a very big aspect of neoliberalism. I know just before the big crash in 2008, the value of all derivative assets in the globe, and derivatives are really a classic sort of example of complex financial investments in money again and again and again. It amounted to almost $700 trillion, but the actual recorded global GDP was $60 trillion. So you have this massive bubble, which is what financialization is about, and it usually, it always will burst. It's in the nature of bubbles. Can't always predict when, but it does always burst. And then, you know, around rationalizing contradictions, again, very quickly, the contradictions that and there are probably many more, but the contradictions that I've come across recently that I wrote a blog about is this engagement in egregious corruption, notwithstanding the commitment to all these good governance principles. And the examples, you know, in South Africa are legion, starting from the arms deal right until the Zuptas at the moment. And I include also the Goldman Sachses, who are opposing the Zuptas, but who have their own record of state capture in the United States, and it's been documented. And what I say there is the way it gets papered over is through what I call preposterous arrogance, which is really do as I say, don't do as I do. And I have been in private business for a short while. Didn't last very long there. But that is exactly what you hear from people, not necessarily in the corporate leadership, but even in smaller companies. You know, do as I say, not as I do. And if you still persist in asking too many questions, then you are identified as having an attitude problem. And then, of course, your tenure is going to be radically truncated. But moving to the critiques of this, and these critiques are, I'm drawing them from classical economy. So classical economists are people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, the French physiocrats, people who, and Marx is also seen by a political economist, current political economist, Michael Hudson, as in the tradition of classical political economy. So what all of them had in common was that they distinguished between earned income and unearned income. And in the days of Adam Smith, it was the landlord class, the idle rich on the land that was extracting rents, and he saw his struggle, and John Stuart Mill apparently similarly, as removing, that was why it was called liberal, removing the controls that the landed gentry had in order to allow space for real productive industrial capital, and wages and profit were seen as earned. So that was why I call this thing a classical economy neo-Marxist critique. So the first point I want to make is that this critique assumes, unlike empiricism, that if you're going to be scientific, you've got to have theory. And I wrote quite a bit of a paragraph there, which I'm not going to read or say more about. I think I made the point earlier on. But the responses to all those 7 points are then as follows. First of all, human nature has a profoundly social aspect. You can't make statements, serious statements, that there's no such thing as society. And there's actually an interesting tradition in Marx about that point. And then the second point is in relation to this idea of economic equilibrium, that the economy, the capitalist economy, is actually inherently unstable. And the booms and the busts that we've seen, particularly in the last 20 years, demonstrate that point, and it's driven mainly by class struggles. And it's not just classical economists and Marxists who say this. George Soros himself says this. And very interestingly enough, from a neoliberal perspective, I think he wants to introduce other institutions that can hold this thing together because of the tendency to instability, booms and busts. But if you're going into the Marxist analysis, it takes you right into the, not just the circulation of capital where these booms and busts happen on the stock market or through currency crises, but in the very production of capital itself, in the production process. The argument that Marx and many Marxists today will present is that trying to solve these problems of instability by trying to regulate finance, which I think is a progressive step, isn't going to solve the problem. Okay, and that's just an interesting aside. There's also quite a strong neo-Marxist tradition that actually has moved away from production and looked purely at the circulation of money and capital as areas where you can actually regulate capitalism and you can sustain them. The theories of earned and unearned capital. I was actually going to beam a little diagram, but it's going to take too long, so I'm going to skip that one, okay? But in terms of unearned capital and theories of earned and unearned capital, from Marx's Capital itself, he had two equations, and the unearned equation was M-M stroke. So M is money that you put into investment, and M stroke is the money plus the surplus coming back at you. And when you invest in oil, when you're betting on oil futures, okay, and you make 40,000 Rand in 20 minutes because your bet comes right, that's an example of unearned. It's unearned. Nobody did any work there. You tapped a few keys, and 20 minutes later, you had an extra 50,000 Rand. But the productive cycle of capital is it's more complex. It has money also starting, M, and then it draws in what is called the means of production and labor power. So labor power is what the laborers will sell in order to be employed and to work. And out of that, commodities are produced and they are sold for a profit, and the money then reflects that profit. So in between M and M, comma, you've got this process of real production. And it also enables actual work to be created. So if you're talking about job creation and being necessary, then this is the area where you should be seriously debating, rather than talking about deregulation and privatization as some magic bullet to get you to job creation. But as I say, under neoliberal ideology, that doesn't even arise, that distinction. The banks as creators of money, there are two interesting papers, one by the Chicago Federal Reserve and another one by two members of the Bank of England from several years ago. So right within the belly of the beast, they say private banks create money. They create money when they make loans, and they create that money out of thin air. It's not simply that they're recycling from savers to borrowers. And this is a very important point for a strategic thinking about, well, if that's how money is created and we need more money, why don't the government just create it through its own bank and lend it to itself and pay itself the interest? And all of a sudden you've dealt with the problem of public debt in a massive way. The question of limits to growth, what neoliberalism and neoclassical economics completely ignores is the limits of resources available as inputs to the economy. They're not unlimited, but the growth at at a small percent every year. Let's say the South African economy grew at 6% every year, which is what we told is the minimum in order to get us to creating enough employment for people. Over 12 years, the economy would have then doubled its size. And the amount of resources that it took in at that point in history, 12 years earlier, 12 years later, it would have taken in the same amount of resources that it needed all those earlier years to get to. And it's an example of the limits that we're talking about. Now, two areas where you see this blindness causing us a lot of problems is oil, is the supply of oil, the ability to produce oil, and there is a number of viewpoints on this. One of them is the peak oil viewpoint, which says we haven't had enough discovery and therefore we're hitting the limits of oil already. And the other one is saying that there is more oil, but it's pure speculation that's driving prices up. And then there's the question of carbon being spewed into the environment, and the environment being limited. Environmental sinks are limited in their ability to actually process this carbon and sequester it. And so we have this massive problem of global warming at the moment. And the strategic responses to how you deal, whether you use carbon trading as a way of dealing with this problem, that would be a neoliberal view, or whether you come in with a carbon tax, which would be moving away from that view. It depends on how you see these processes working out. The last point about the integration of the state and the economy, and I know John wanted me to talk more about this, but I've written it, John. It's going to take too long. I've looked at a particular economist that we all familiar with, Nikos Poulantzas, and state power socialism as one of the most developed attempts by a Marxist at a theory of the state that can show what the relationship is between the state and the economy. And I think it raises quite a lot of interesting questions there for understanding states. And one of the things he talks about is the state as the condensation of the relationship of forces. And he shows how to think of the state not as something separate that has some benign influence, but it's always implementing certain interests, and it depends on the balance of forces outside. And since the period 79 to 94, the popular working class forces have slid, and the forces of capital and various fractions of capital, particularly finance, have become very much empowered and have managed to push the state into certain strategies. And note, I don't use the word capture, because capture implies that the state it's an instrument. You capture it and you use it. This is a far more social process-driven thing, and it requires a different understanding, and it would lead to different strategies than this idea of state capture. And one of the problems that I have with the current use of that word by people who are fighting Zuma. I think the whole point of going through this way of looking at things is to say what we really need and what history has shown us in the case of the social democratic welfare states, but even in the case of some emerging economies like Singapore, which Helen Ziller opened her mouth about recently and revealed a hell of a lot of ignorance actually in the process, and Hong Kong and China. Let's not forget China. These countries have gone through massive GDP growth because of what I call state intervention development. So you can't, where where we, my partner Morgan and I, have ended up from our work in this area is that if we want to have the urban and the regional developments that we need, you've got to think of state intervention. What type of state is a whole different question, and how you organize to actually make that state more democratic and more sort of sensitive to strategies, to implementing strategies, is a whole different question, and it's a very important question. But I'm saying we can't really start thinking about that until we've sorted out. I mean, you can think about it, of course, but I think you think about it more clearly when you've sorted out what is the bigger structure of the economy and the society, and how's it understood and how's it mystified. Otherwise, I think you get led down a path which we were led down after '94, and I include myself in there right away. What I put on the shelf, and it took me up to the xenophobia of 2008 to wake up from what I called my Rip van Winkelian sleep. So I think I need to draw it to a close there. The latter parts that I haven't got time to talk about, because I think it's only fair to hear what thoughts have come up on your side and questions, was just looking at the last 20 years. You know, what was that neoliberal strategy, you know, in terms of the Housing White Paper, the Botshabelo Accord, the Mortgage Indemnity Fund, the National Housing Finance Corporation, the National Home Builders Registration Council, Breaking New Ground, this wonderful progressive policy, and then the spatial targeting that the Treasury engaged in from 2012 as a major strategy. And then the 3 points that I would have wanted to talk more about, but just to mention them quickly, in terms of where I think public intervention strategies could go. 3 areas that would be doing things in a new way and take a holistic way to neoliberal logic. The first would be what Michael Hudson, who I mentioned earlier, calls fiscal reform, where you penalize the financial, the insurance and the real estate sectors, the speculative sectors. You tax away that unearned income. You charge them 1.5 times the tax that you charge the productive sectors. And you charge that on the PAYE tax of the employees also. So you hit that whole thing and you start incentivizing people to invest into the productive part of the economy. There's a whole debate around that. I just want to throw the idea out. And then the actual public investment. Public investment needs to be shaped into certain areas. You could have a lot more social housing, and you could have a lot more development if you had the capital. And I mentioned public banking as one example. So that's the second strategic sort of focal point, public banking. And there's a lot being written on public banking, particularly in the United States. It's a public banking institute. There's the Bank of North Dakota, which has been around and survived and flourished actually across the 2008 crash. And interestingly, some of those people have actually been in South Africa, but they only got as far as Salga. They didn't get to Paul Hendler. And then finally, public land for residential development. Essentially what I'm saying there, what we're saying there is municipalities are not referees, they're not neutral referees. They actually get in there and they must be biased to the poor and the marginalized, and if necessary they must expropriate land. You can expropriate land, you don't need to change the constitution even. And they need to play quite a lot of roles there, and there's a lot under the SPLUMA, Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Act, that would actually justify this. You wouldn't even have to go and create a whole lot of new law or regulation, I think. You can tell me if you agree with that. So that's where I think strategically one would end off. But then, as I said earlier, that's all, you know, between us sitting around the room here. Who are the forces, and how do you interact with them? And I started reading. I was following a conversation with you, Hegemony and Social Strategy by the Clow and Mouffe, and I found it a very interesting look back at different forces across the last 100 years. And I'm not going to even touch that now, okay? But clearly that is a major area. Otherwise, we're just talking, we're just talking. So I'm sorry I did go on a bit longer there, and thank you for your patience and not falling asleep.
Well, thank you, Paul. You've given us a very grand overview of neoliberalism, and certainly a lot to digest there in terms of the various forces at play, from both the empirical as well as theoretical, particularly the theoretical grasp we have on these issues. Certainly interesting, the role of banks, the role of institutions, and especially when you're looking at not only our local context but the broader context, certainly in America. There's a lot there to digest, but it's a clear overview of neoliberalism, and thanks. I'm sure it has stimulated for us a lot of important points for discussion, hopefully, and maybe a debate, because I'm sure not everything that Paul has said people would agree with. Yeah, let's hear your opinions and views. Maybe we take a pause, because there's been a lot of talking so far, and come back and give us 10 minutes to come back and hopefully talk about it. But thanks.
Oh, thank you.